Let the words of my mouth and the meditations of my heart be acceptable in your sight, O Lord. Hello, everybody. I'm speaking here from the dining room of the Nashua Soup Kitchen and Shelter on 2 Quincy Street. I don't normally wear clerical collar going to work, my Monday through Friday job, but it's one of those rare opportunities when what I do here also then intersects with my religious vocation, and so we'll have a brief moment where the two of those come together. Gospel today is really interesting. You know, I was struck by that phrase, do not be afraid. Do not be afraid. When I first read that line, I was drawn back to my first Christmas pageant, where at age 4, I was the role of Gabriel. Now, I have something of a loud voice. I believe the first time I gave the dismissal after being ordained a deacon, I nearly broke the mic. True confession, one of my college roommates said I was the loudest person he ever met. To a degree, I attribute my auditory volume to this first acting experience in the Christmas pageant. Evidently, I practiced my line by going around to everyone. My parents, the neighbors, my dog said, "Do not be afraid," as loud as I could. I was a cute kid. I have the pictures of me in a cowboy vest and fringe to prove it. Not as cute as my younger brother, Peter, who marched into church as an African-American 3-year-old and said, "Here I am, Lord, give me some bread." This was right around the time when giving communion to all baptized became common, so his being able to receive communion was a pretty big deal. But I digress. This sermon is about food, fear, and faith. But it would be easy and appropriate to make this sermon just about my Monday through Friday job. It's inconceivable to me that hunger should be an issue in the United States. We are the wealthiest nation in the world, and yet 80 million Americans, roughly 25% of our population, struggles with food insecurity, among other things coming into this very room for breakfast, for dinner, and to go to our pantry. 12.9 million children are at risk of hunger. According to Feed America, 84% of households served by food pantries report buying the cheapest food instead of the healthiest food in order to provide enough to eat. Imagine that. Imagine buying food you know is unhealthy, that you know won't help your children grow to be the people that you know they can be, not because you won't, but because you can't. Imagine that. And at the same time, let us remember we are a food exporter to the world. Let us remember that 40% of the food we make is wasted. Take the birthday cake from a recent family celebration, or the wedding cake of my daughter just 3 weeks ago. Cut it nearly in half and throw that part into the trash, and you will have an appreciation for the waste. I almost wish this gospel reading for John was instead about the talents being buried in the ground, for truly what we are doing with the bounty we have been given is akin to literally plowing crops in the ground when it could do so much more. At NSKS, we are part of a food rescue program, bringing fresh produce, which might otherwise be wasted, to locations across Nashua, including 10 mobile pantries, as well as our central distribution point right here at 2 Quincy. Any given week, 2,280 pounds of food are going to places like Bronstein Apartments, Major Drive, Ledge Street Elementary, River Pines. A significant portion of our neighbors are hungry. Right here in southern New Hampshire and across the country, we need to do something. Of course, 2,000 years ago, a significant portion of the people with Jesus were also hungry. Think for a moment about the loaves of barley. Barley is not an easy grain. It doesn't taste light and wafery, while various food sites describe it as delicious, subtle, nutty flavor with a slightly chewy texture. I can attest the slightly chewy texture takes the lead, and I might be inclined to remove the word slightly. The fact of the matter is that barley is not the grain of the well-to-do, but those who prioritize quantity over quality, where they want their money to feed as many mouths as possible. Think for a moment as to who had the loaves. It was not a grown-up, but a child. Jesus was speaking to and feeding those who at best didn't have much to eat, specifically children. Think about the 5,000 people gathered around Jesus. They were separated from their homes and villages. They were apart from the institutions which they relied for nourishment. They were hungry. Many of us went off or have gone off to camp over the past summer for a week, perhaps two. This might be similar to what those who were gathered around Jesus with respect to distance traveled and nearby amenities. And yet there was no local grocery store they could go to. There was no car to jump into for more supplies. The gospel has very poor people surrounding Jesus, and he ensures everyone is fed. I would also say that this is not the only feeding miracle in the New Testament. It is one of 6. Clearly, to all of the authors of the Gospels, the miracle of feeding the 5,000, and for 2, the feeding of 4,000, was a cornerstone of their faith. These stories are mentioned in the Sibylline Oracles, quoted by Justin Martyr in the year 150, by Augustine several hundred years later. Ichthys, or fish, appeared as the Greek letters iota, chi, theta, epsilon, and sigma, inscribed in tombs by certainly the late 2nd century, early 3rd. Feeding hungry people was important to Jesus. It was important to early Christians, and it is important for us to be practicing this part of our faith today. Making a donation of food, especially fresh produce, part of your comprehensive philanthropic plan, is one thing that you can do. Volunteering one day a month to provide produce or to make a meal is one thing that you can do. Just talk to 3 people and explain to them how New Hampshire can be a leader in ensuring all people, especially all children, can have enough to eat. It's one thing you can do. If we really want to live the hymn, I want to be a child of God, I want to follow Jesus, then we have to start making a part of our daily practice, part of our pattern of living. That is food, but I want to turn to fear. I want to turn to pain. I don't know if you have ever been hungry, but I believe all of us have experienced fear. Fear is pervasive in our lives. Our teens worry their lives will end if they don't get into the right college. Parents worry their children will be a failure if they don't start talking by a certain age, find the right social group, or don't start the right job. Transcending all of these things, perhaps hidden by the quotidian nature of our lives, is the fear of death. When we are children, we live in the world of the present. It's hard, if not impossible, to understand the past and the future. When we're in our 20s, we appreciate the past and the future. We understand that life passes, and we are sure, overly sure, death will not happen to us. I'm now in my 50s, and 3 months ago, my girlfriend's mom died suddenly. Though she'd been given a clean bill of health by her doctor just 4 days previous, she went from feeling fine to a cardiac arrest in the space of 24 hours. The time passing has obviously been hard, but I can't help but note that when I went out for a bike ride after hearing the news, the nonchalant, carefree attitude I take to my rides was missing. We live in fear, we live in worry. And it brings me to the second part of our gospel reading. I mentioned earlier, as has likely been said to you several times before, that the feeding miracles are the only ones to appear in all 4 gospels. While each author of the gospels was drawing upon shared and unique sources, the gospel we read today is one of the only places all 4 narratives are informed by the same source. It therefore makes it even more important that both John and Mark, authors coming from 2 very different places, paired the feeding of the 5,000 with the miracle of walking on water, indicating that this pairing, this bringing together, predated either's authorship. The question I would ask is why? Why was it important for the early church to read these 2 stories of Jesus' ministry together? One answer is it might just simply be a rhetorical device. It's oftentimes said, if you want to make a point, you need to say something, say it again, and then tell people what you just said. By the way, this sermon is about food, fear, and faith. From that perspective, we might have this second miracle to emphasize the point which has already been established, that Jesus is miraculous. On the other hand, we tend to think of the disciples as people who just didn't get it. From this perspective, the disciples need to have the second miracle because while they witnessed the first, they need the point to be additionally made. You might hear the narrator, Jesus, saying to himself, okay, feeding the 5,000 was enough. Well, I guess I just need to walk on water. But I think that there's a different reason these 2 stories are paired. The Jesus movement told by the Gospels was a moment about setting traditions and expectations on its head. The Son of Man, a concept that goes back into the books of Daniel and before, shall appear not as a fire-breathing warrior, but as a healer, a comforter of the weary, a welcomer of children. This is not which had been foretold. The King of Israel shall reign not upon a throne, but die upon a cross. Incongruous. Jesus is aware of the failings of the kings of Jerusalem. From Saul on down, there is no perfect king, but only flawed humans trying and failing to be something they were not. Jesus was not affirming the standards of success at the time. He was saying a life lived as a child of God, is a life lived differently. My guess is that there is a certain amount of status to be associated with Jesus as a disciple. Even as Jesus was heading for the hills, when the crowds would make him king, his disciples had taken a decidedly us versus thou perspective. Notice the language that Philip uses. Where are we to buy bread for these people to eat? Where are we to buy bread for these people to eat? I have no idea regarding Philip's class. He may have been the equivalent of today's middle class. He may have been poor. It's unlikely he was wealthy. But what he was rich by association. These people is not language you would use if you consider yourself to be one in the crowd. These people is not what I would like to hear people say as they volunteer at NSKS. Yet there was this dichotomy between the disciples and the crowds, and it is my guess that the disciples needed that moment on the boat, that moment of fear, that moment when they were reminded just how fragile, how tenuous, how momentary life can be. They needed to know that their position was not something which could be placed in the bank with interest drawn on a regular basis. They needed to know that the hunger for food, for kinship, for love is something to which we all aspire, to which we all need. Without Jesus, they were literally lost at sea. It was only through his presence that they arrived on the shores safely. I want you to go back to that moment of fear, about fear of the future, for our friends, about death. Most of the time, we create a dichotomy between those who are in our group and those who are outside our group. 20th century theologian Reinhold Niebuhr once said, "The problem with human beings is that we have very poor imaginations." It is easy to imagine and to care about those who are in group, our family, our friends, our co-workers. It is much harder, even for the disciples, to imagine caring for those who are out of group, those who are different from us, those who are other. It was only a great storm which led the disciples to experience the fear and the pain of those who are hungry. How do we bridge the divide between those who are in group and those who are out? Perhaps it's through children. Perhaps it's through listening to children, listening to the problems they face and the answers they provide that can cross that bridge. At NSKS, we are all metaphorical children. When we prepare breakfast or dinner here, the only question we ask is, are you hungry? And if the answer is yes, we feed you. Quite honestly, we would feed you anyway. If you're unemployed, we help you find a job. If you need a blanket or a coat or a pair of warm mittens, they are yours for the taking. When he was with us, Martin Luther King Jr. used to talk about 3 types of love: eros, romantic love; philia, the reciprocal kind of affection between friends; and agape, the highest form of love. For Dr. King, agape love was, quote, purely spontaneous, unmotivated, groundless, and creative. He goes on to write, "It is the love of God operating in the human heart. At NSKS, this is the love we try to practice. This is the driving force behind the work we do. You may be aware we are in a campaign to renovate the old Sacred Heart Elementary School on Spring Street in Nashua. Our existing shelters do a good job being safe, warm, and dry, but they're not as good at providing hope. They do not offer children a place to play. They do not offer medical care for the infirm. They do not offer a center for education, allowing one to fulfill the potential that exists within all of us. Until I'm really at the shelter. They do not offer that individual has a hard time staying housed, sleeping on the streets and in the hallways, a permanent place to lay his or her head. The Spring Street Forward campaign is our effort to bring the concept of agape to the shelter we provide. If you'd like to learn more, please email me, michael@nsks.org, or find me here at 2 Quincy Street or on the streets of Nashua. Finally, let us think about the moment of faith, that moment of grace. When I was a kid, my parents attended a summer retreat called Camp's Farthest Out, which still has a presence today on Lake Winnipesaukee. At this camp, I remember a person speaking, though I was only 5 or 6, about traveling with nothing but faith, and yet how everything was provided, even a birthday cake at the appropriate time. The memory feels somewhat apocryphal, but I would say that in my Monday through Friday job, it's a lived experience. I don't know how the donations of food and financial gifts make their way to us. We try our best to tell people what we need, but to be honest, serendipity is the best explanation I can provide. Every day, 150 people receive a hot meal. 40 nights of shelter are provided. 500 pounds of fresh produce and 420 days of long-term staples go out the door. 5 loaves of barley fed the 5,000, and they are brought to us by a child. I would suggest to you that fear is what is present when those that love us feel far away. The disciples felt fear when Jesus was away. The crowd of 5,000 were afraid of hunger. We are afraid to be without. Perhaps we can spend a little bit of time with the hymn, We'll Understand It By and By, sung so well by Sweet Honey in the Rock. We are often destitute of the things that life demands, want of food and want of shelter, thirsty hills and barren lands. We're trusting in the Lord, and we're according to his word, and we'll understand it better by and by. Amen.